Okay, let's begin. So, but this is a somewhat of a complicated Gemara because it was comparing different laws, laws of Tumah and different shiurim, different measurements of laws, figuring out if we can combine the two to prohibit to invalidate a sukkah. And the Gemara was telling us the dialogue, which was a little complicated because trying to prove each other wrong when each of the opinions seems to the problem with one seems to apply to the other as well. In other words, he was claiming, the Rabbah was claiming that the students of Rav were wrong based on some logic that seemingly his opinion also seems to have such a fault, such a warped way of such a problem in his way of thinking as well. And he tries to get out of it, and there seems to go back and forth trying to prove. Normally you have proofs that sort of like hit you right on. These are very like curveball type of proofs where basing it on the fact that um, why are the invalidations of a sukkah not combinable? Which is not exactly what they were talking about. What their issue was how big of a space is invalid, and we're using this idea of the fact that you can't combine the two if it depends if it's logical, if it's based on logic, or if it's based on a halacha l'maisha misinai. So this was some of the complications. Then we tried to prove things from the laws of Tumah about joining measurements from one type of garment to another material, and does it combine or doesn't it combine? We got sort of like a side issue of combining things or not, but they do, the application, of course. We can understand it does apply to sukkah because the sukkah, and it could even be a practical, into if you have non-kosher schach on your sukkah, maybe like a tree or an overhang, and then near it is some empty space on your sukkah. So I guess there is a practical application of these laws, and the question would be if they join together, can you join non-kosher schach with empty space? And seemingly the Gemara seems pretty clear that you don't join the two. Now, I did want to mention that Taisvis has an interesting question. He says, if you didn't have the case of the Gemara, if you have a similar case, but not the Gemara's case was you have non-kosher schach, and next to it you have empty space. That was the Gemara's case. Taisvis says, what about pick another case where you have non-kosher schach, very little, 2 handbreadths. So, you really have less than the issue, the amount. And then you have empty space. And then you have not more non-kosher schach. Do you combine the 2 non-kosher schachs in that scenario? In other words, we're not worried about the empty space in the middle being considered adding to the non-kosher schach. That's not what we're doing. But we're wondering if you can connect the two. So you have, let's say, 2 handbreadths of non-kosher schach, like skewers, 2 handbreadths. Then you have empty space, 2 handbreadths, let's say. And then you have 2 handbreadths of skewers. So you've got altogether, you do have 4 handbreadths of non-kosher schach, but there's empty space in the middle. In that scenario, will we combine these 2 areas of the skewers to make it 4 handbreadths in order to invalidate the sukkah? So that's an interesting question. Again, our Gemara's case was you do not have enough invalid schach to invalidate your sukkah. You do not have enough of empty space to invalidate your sukkah. But if you combine the two, then that would invalidate your sukkah. And the Gemara seemed pretty clear that you don't, nor under normal circumstances, you don't combine the two. And they're different different rules. They don't combine, even though Rabbah thinks, according to the other opinion, they should combine. But even the other opinion seems pretty clear that they don't combine. So you don't combine the two. Again, the case was that neither have sufficient amount to invalidate the sukkah. The non-kosher schach is not sufficient, and the empty space is not sufficient. Taisus gives a case where it is sufficient. You do have 4 hand breaths of non-kosher schach. You have sufficient amount of non-kosher schach, but it's being separated by empty space. So if you have it separated by empty space, would we then say that it combines together to invalidate your sukkah? So that's the question of Taisvis, of where in the bottom Taisus over there he says that we have two tfachim hand breadths of schach puzzle, 2 tfachim of schach puzzle, and you have empty space in the middle less than 3. So let's say 2 hand breadths. So he says you could be mesapek equal lesfuke. You could question if these 2 psulim would join together now into 4 and invalidate your sukkah. Or do we say that since there's empty space in the middle, it doesn't join? Or since there is less than 3 handbreadths of that empty space, it should join. Now, he says if it was 1.5 handbreadths of non-kosher schach, then some empty space, then again 1.5 handbreadths of empty of non-kosher schach. In that scenario, he says the space is not going to join it together, which is basically what our Gemara said. You don't join empty space with non-kosher schach. But what would happen if you have enough? You have sufficient non-kosher schach, but you do have some space in the middle. And he says, would you then join it together? And that's Taisus's question. Iko lesfuke, he says. It seems questionable. So Taisus is wondering about this case where you have sufficient non-kosher schach, but you have empty space in the middle. Will we say that they are attached to invalidate your sukkah? Anyway, that's a Taisus on the bottom of the page. So let's just give a fast review of this Gemara. Basically, the discussion here in the way this was taught in Surah, the way it was taught in Surah was that there's a students of the yeshiva of Rav followed this understanding that non-kosher schach invalidates a sukkah when it has 4 hand breadths in the middle of the sukkah. And if it's on the side of the sukkah, you have up to 4 cubits of non-kosher schach. That was the way the students of Rav in his yeshiva, that's how they understood it. Rabbah argued on that, and Rabbah wanted to say that wherever you have non-kosher schach, whether it's in the middle of the sukkah or whether it's on the side of the sukkah, you always have up to 4 cubits. So according to Rabbah, it makes it very easy. If you have like maybe a tree on top of your sukkah or something, you often can get away with a lot, because you could have big areas of non-kosher schach up to 4 cubits, which is like 6 feet or possibly even more than that, of non-kosher schach, even going all through your whole sukkah. And up to that, it won't ruin your sukkah, which is quite a sizable amount. Now, this is the way Rabbah understands. This is the way Rabbah understands it. And the interesting thing is that we don't really find clearly a Mishnah that tells us how much non-kosher schach can you have in the middle of the sukkah. The Mishnah never gives us this measurement. That's why there's a debate here. In other words, our Mishnah talks about non-kosher schach, and it mentions this measurement of 4 cubits, but you could easily learn our Mishnah to mean it's only on the side, because that's the seemingly understood. That's the way it seems to to be understood. It's, if you think about it, it's bias shenifchas, and it talks about the wall having up to 4 cubits until the schach. So the other case is the chutzner with the nachsadra, the porticos. This is another case where the case is very clear that it's on the side is where you have this non-kosher schach up to 4 cubits. And then the sukkah gedola that you surrounded with something that you're not allowed to be masachich with. So all the cases in the Mishnah are cases of invalid schach around the sukkah, not in the middle of the sukkah. So the reason why there's a debate about what happens if you have non-kosher schach in the middle of the sukkah is because we don't have a clear teaching about that. It doesn't say clearly how much schach can you non-kosher schach can you have in the middle of the sukkah before it invalidates it. We don't have a clear teaching about that. We do have a clear teaching about if there's empty space, because it mentions here there's empty space 3 handbreadths. But about the non-kosher schach, it is a little vague. So Rabbah is of the understanding that whenever you have this non-kosher schach, you always get up to 4 cubits. And they tried to prove things back, and there was a whole dialogue. So let's just summarize that dialogue. The first question that Rabbah asked on the students of Rav was, well, what would happen if you have next to each other, you have non-kosher schach, and you have non-kosher schach, and you have empty space. So what would be the law then? They said, well, obviously it's kosher if neither of them have sufficient amount together. So Rabbah said, well, why can't they? He says, well, actually, I skipped something. The first Rabbah says, how could you say your law? You see, our Mishnah says 4 cubits. That was the first question. Our Mishnah says 4 cubits. They answered him that no, our Mishnah ben Akuma. Both Rav and Shmuel learned that it's doifen akuma. That's the first thing. Now, so that's specifically a special case, doifen akuma. So then he says his thing about if you have non-kosher schach less than the sufficient amount, it was less than what you say, it was 4 handbreadths, less than what they hold is a problem. So in those less than 4 handbreadths, and you have empty space less than 3 handbreadths. So what's going to happen if you have them together? Is it going to be kosher or not kosher? And the obvious answer is it's kosher, because each one is a separate entity. There's non-kosher schach and there's empty space. So neither of them have sufficient amount. That should be kosher. Then he says, well, why, if you fill it with skewers that are non-kosher schach, fill the empty space with skewers, why then will it not invalidate why then will it invalidate the sukkah? Because you have too much, but skewers should be much less a problem than empty space. And if skewers invalidate your sukkah, if you add skewers to the empty space and make it altogether the amount 4 handbreadths of non-kosher schach, it'll invalidate your sukkah. For sure, if there's empty space, it should invalidate your sukkah. So basically what he's saying is you should be able to combine your empty space with the non-kosher schach. That's more or less what he's saying. He's saying, and you see it from the fact that if you switch that empty space with skewers, it would invalidate your sukkah. And so for sure, empty space, which is worse, should for sure invalidate your sukkah. That was his claim. So the question back on him was, well, according to you, you have the same problem because you just hold a different measurement. You also hold 4 cubits invalidates your sukkah of non-kosher schach. You don't hold 4 handbreadths, you hold 4 cubits. Okay, so we'll play the game on you. When you have a non-kosher schach of up to 4 cubits, and next to it is empty space, what's going to happen then? Do they join? No. Well, why not? If it's empty space, if empty space is worse than non-kosher schach, and if you fill the empty space with skewers, you're going to have 4 cubits altogether of non-kosher schach. Is that going to invalidate your sukkah? For sure, yes. It'll invalidate your sukkah. So why should empty space, which is much stricter than skewers, why should empty space not invalidate your sukkah? So they questioned him back the same thing. Shouldn't the empty space be just as bad as the non-kosher schach as skewers? And so he said to them, no, there's a difference, because I hold, because by me there's a reason why, and this is where the page turn. We turn to page 17b. By me, there's a difference. In my case, there's a difference. Why? Because the law about 4 cubits is a law that is a special law. Halacha l'maisha misinai. It's a law given to Moses Sinai that the law of non-kosher schach goes by 4 cubits, and the law of empty space is a law of 3 handbreadths. It's a totally different rule, and it's based on a different reasoning, and therefore they don't join together. You can't measure the two together. They're 2 different shiurim, 2 different measurements. But according to you, that it's based on a makom choshev, the concept of 4 handbreadths, you're using logic to come up with this idea that in the middle of the sukkah, it should invalidate your sukkah if you have non-kosher schach up to 4 cubits or more. It'll invalidate your sukkah. What's the rule of that? Is based on the concept of makom chashuv, like that's considered a sizable amount of space, and that would be the reason for to invalidate your sukkah. That reason, that logic should apply even to empty space. It also will make a gap. It's all about having a gap in your sukkah. And if the gap of 4 handbreadths is considered a gap, which is what you're claiming, so why should it be a difference between empty space and or skewers or non-kosher stock? A gap is a gap, so you should be able to combine the two. That was his claim to them, and therefore it should be it should be invalid, and therefore he's basically trying to prove that it must be that you should go by the concept of 4 cubits. That's more or less what it seems that he's implying. Like, you should follow my way of thinking fits much better. In other words, your way of thinking, you get into this problem. My way of thinking, you don't have this problem. So that was his question. So Abaye told him back that there is a scenario where the measurements are equal. Now, what is that scenario? And the way Rashi understands it is because there's a scenario that the measurements of non-kosher schach and empty space, because there's a scenario where they equal the same shear, the same measurement, so which is like in a small sukkah. So you see that there is a concept of having the same measurement, and therefore they should be able to combine together even according to you, and the question will be even according to you. And not that Abaye is answering the question, he's just saying that you came up with your whole problem over here on us. The problem really applies to you as well. It's an interesting question. It's philosophical a little, trying to figure out what would happen in such a scenario, and it's a very complicated way of making this question and creating a whole problem here. But the way you're creating this problem, the problems would apply to you as well. And he proves it because of this small sukkah where you're going to have the same measurement of three handbreadths. Now, 3 handbreadths is a very interesting law over here, that we're going to say that when you have a small sukkah, 3 handbreadths is going to invalidate your sukkah. If you have 3 handbreadths of a non-kosher schach, or 3 handbreadths of empty space, like everyone is going to agree over here that it's going to be non-kosher, that's going to ruin your sukkah. Now, what is the reason? Why would 3 handbreadths of empty space or 3 handbreadths of non-kosher schach invalidate your sukkah? So the simple understanding that Rashi gives is that there's a law called lavud. Lavud allows you to combine anything that's within 3 handbreadths. If there's an empty space or non-kosher schach of 3 handbreadths, you no longer can say the law of lavud. Now, we normally say that the empty space of lavud, normally we say lavud when it comes to an empty space. But when it comes to a non-kosher schach, that law of lavud normally doesn't apply there. We don't know of that. But Rashi, at least here in Sukkah, seems to hold that it's the concept of 3 handbreadths is based on the law of lavud. If you look in Rashi, he says, Kivan de nafik miteras lavud, since it leaves, and the Rashi miloi shavu shiurayu, the measurements aren't the measurements equal in a small sukkah that is very limited? It's 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths. You have such a small sukkah, and then you have this amount of non-kosher schach. So al karchach, Rashi says, for sure, against your will, the rule would be 3 handbreadths. It's going to be equal because given the nafik materis lavud, since it's no longer within the rules of lavud, it's going to ruin your measurement of your sukkah, which you need to have of 7 handbreadths. And since the measurements are equal, so he says, very interesting, that since the measurements are equal, le'inyan shum sukkah litzterufe. Any sukkah, they should be able to join together. The laws of non-kosher schach and the laws of empty space should be able to join together. So basically, what the way Rashi is learning is that the law of the fact that it's 3 handbreadths, it should, and it shows you that these measurements are the same measurements, and because they're the same measurements by a small sukkah, they should and it doesn't the law of lavud will no longer apply. They are, whether you have schach or whether you have empty space, it causes you not to be able to use this law of lavud, and it should invalidate even a small sukkah. The other understanding is not based on lavud; it's based on the fact that this is a very insignificant amount of space, less than 3 handbreadths, but 3 handbreadths becomes more significant. But in any event, that's the way the dialogue goes. That Abaye is answering the Rabbah back, and Rabbah answers him back. Also, a little complicated answer. What he says is that it's not about them joining together. It's about the fact that the sukkah doesn't have enough measurement. It needs to have 7 handbreadths. So he's saying it's not that these measurements join. It's that you don't have the proper measurement of a sukkah. That's the way. That's the answer that Abaye gives. Anyway, then Abaye goes further and argues and says, well, what about when you join different measurements together? Is that a problem? You claim that you can't join measurements together. I hold you can even join measurements together, and we see it from the laws of Tumah. You can join different measurements together. You see it. You could join the beged with the sock, and you have these laws of impurity. People, the zav, the person who's impure from a strong level of impurity, he sits on this. It would make this garment impure, and so we see that even different measurements are able to combine. So even something that normally follows the rule of 3 by 3, and you have something else that follows the law of 4 by 4, 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths. Nevertheless, if let's say that's missing a little, you can add from the 3 by 3 to the 4 by 4 and make it up to 4 by 4 and invalidate it. So you see, you can join things. The even different measurements can join the other measurements to make it tummy, to make it impure. And the same thing should apply to non-kosher schach, to empty space. It should be able to combine together. And that was, again, he's fighting Rabbah on Rabbah's assumptions. Rabbah's making these assumptions that if they're 2 separate rules, different measurements, you can't join together. He's saying, no, that's not even true. That fact that point that you made is not necessarily true. You see that it could join together, and the answer that's given is that the answer that's given that Rabbah gives is over there. There's a reason for it. That since there is a place where it is an equal measurement, what happens if you cut out one of these garments to a tefach and a tefach to be a patch, to handbreadth by a handbreadth size, but it's going to be for a patch for a donkey's saddle. So there you see that all of these will all have the same measurement. So since they all will have the same measurement, therefore they can combine together. So that was basically the end of that dialogue. Now, the Gemara then says, in Surah, this was the way they learned it, but in Neherdah, they had another version of this, of the opinion that how much non-kosher schach invalidates your sukkah. So they had a different opinion of what Rav holds. Again, Rav held in Surah, he held that it invalidates your sukkah for handbreadths. But in Neherdah, there's a different version of what Rav really held, and it's the Gemara tells us that it's Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav. I'm sorry, Rabbi Yehuda says the name of Shmuel one opinion, and then it says Rav says a different opinion. So we have the opinion of Rav telling us different than the previous Gemara because in a different yeshiva they had a different tradition of what Rav's view was. So what was Rav's view according to this new version? According to the new version, only Shmuel said the other opinion, not Rav. Rav really holds like Rabbah held. So Rav, we now have Rav holding the way what we understood before to be Rabbah's opinion. Now we're saying this is really Rav's view. And so the Gemara says in Neherdah, they learned, Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Shmuel, that there's a difference between, and Shmuel's view was that there's a difference between on the side of the sukkah or in the middle of the sukkah, that you have 4 hand breadths in the middle of the sukkah, 4 cubits on the side, up to 4 cubits on the side of the sukkah, and only if it's more than that does it invalidate it. Rav says it doesn't matter the side or in the middle, it's always 4 cubits. That's what the Rav's opinion is. It doesn't matter. 4 cubits is the line. If it's under 4 cubits, it's kosher. If it's more than 4, if it's 4 cubits or more, it's invalid. And that's really where we got up to. So we are on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, page 17b. And the question that I ended off last in the class was, now, if you hold that the law that the invalid schach invalidates your sukkah at 4 cubits, whether on the side of your sukkah or in the middle of your sukkah. So what is the practical application of the law of Daifen Akuma, which is the halacha l'maisha misinai? When does it apply? When can you apply the law of Daifen Akuma, of the bent wall? Because according to Rav, you don't need the law of a bent wall. You could have up to 4 cubits of space of non-kosher schach on the side of your sukkah. You have non-kosher schach up to 4 cubits, and the law is that it's kosher because you don't have sufficient amount to invalidate your sukkah. So what do you need the law of Daifen Akuma, that it's a bent wall? It's non-kosher schach. It doesn't have to be a bent wall. Leave it as non-kosher schach. Why do you need the law of Daifen Akuma? What does Daifen Akuma really do? So the simple understanding, at least the way the Pnei Yeshua has an answer, that basically both answers are very similar. Pnei Yeshua's answer is that you could have up to 2 times now. If you have he holds of Daifen Akuma, and Daifen Akuma allows you 4 cubits, up to 4 cubits, and guess what? The law of non-kosher schach gives you another up to 4 cubits, and your sukkah would still be kosher. So he holds of Daifen Akuma. If I'm not mistaken, that's the understanding of the Pnei Yeshua. And the other answer that's given is also very similar to that. So in other words, the case the Pnei Yeshua gives is, let's say it's 7 cubits of non-kosher schach by the wall. So if you didn't have Daifen Akuma, you have a problem because it's more than 4 cubits of non-kosher schach. But since you have Daifen Akuma, so you have up to 4 of non-kosher schach. Daifen Akuma is called a wall. And the rest, and you start measuring the non-kosher schach, and you have less than 4 cubits, and therefore you'll be able to have a kosher sukkah. You know, that's one answer. The other answer is that let's say you have less than 4 cubits of non-kosher schach, and next to it is 3 hand breadths or less than 3 hand breadths of empty space. And then you have non-kosher schach less than 4 cubits. So what happens is that if we would not say Daifen Akuma, if we wouldn't say the bent wall, what you have here is non-kosher schach, an empty space in the middle, and we would say that they combine. But since we say Daifen Akuma, that the first up to 4 cubits of the first group of non-kosher schach is really part of the wall, then there's no combination of the non-kosher schach and the empty space. and you're able to have a kosher sukkah. Very similar cases, but that's basically how they understand that there is a law of Dofen Akuma, even according to the other opinion. It basically gives you a huge amount of non-kosher schach opportunity. Yes, Jeffrey.
I see how that applies when like what we used to have in our synagogue. We had a storeroom, and the storeroom had a space in the middle, and from the wall of the storeroom there was part of a roof in all directions. So that was Dofen Akuma, and we could still use, because it wasn't that large, and we could still use a space in the middle, which had no wall right close to it, as the sukkah.
Right. Well, that's the regular law of Dofen Akuma.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm adding.
Right. It's no space. Yeah, it's not space.
What I'm adding is you get double Dofen Akuma, according to Rav. You could have 7 cubits, which is what?
But then you have to have a tremendous sukkah.
What? You got to have a huge sukkah, right?
Sukkah, and the wind blew off your mat or something like that.
Right. Well, the practical application of this is where you have a very large hangover from the roof, or you have a big tree blocking on one side. This is a very this would be the case where it's where you could have a very large amount of Dofen Akuma. I also mentioned, I think it was yesterday, that there is or maybe it was the day before, about who's the halacha like, because normally we paskin like the Lishna Basra, like the final version. And normally the halacha follows Rav against Shmuel when it comes to halacha. When it comes to monetary laws, we follow Shmuel. When it comes to halacha laws like Isser, Veheter, laws of what's permissible, what's not permissible, what's kosher, what's not, those laws we follow Rav. So there are Rishonim that hold that this is the final halacha. Surprisingly, because of course we're not familiar with those opinions. In Shulchan Aruch, they paskin the other way, but there are such Rishonim that paskin this way, that this is the halacha, because this is the norm. You follow the second version, the final version, Lishna Basra, the final version, and this is the final version of the Gemara, and it's the halacha follows Rav versus Shmuel. Now the other opinions have to explain that we only do that when it's a d'Rabbanan, when it's a rabbinic law, when it's a biblical law, and it would be a would be a leniency to go that way. We don't follow the second, the Lishna Basra. Instead, we'd follow the Lishna Kama. And here, the Lishna Kama, the first version, is that Rav is the more strict one, and he would hold that there's a difference between on the side of the sukkah and in the middle of the sukkah. On the side, you do have 4 cubits because of Dofen Akuma, and in the middle of the sukkah, you have 4 handbreadths. So that would be the halacha, of course, that's the way we paskin. But there were Rishonim like the Bahag, Al Halachas Gedolos, he held like the halacha should follow the Lishna Basra. Okay, so we're gonna start the inside the Gemara on page 17b. I'm just going to start again from B'neherda Masna. In Neherda, they learned. B'neherda is the last word on the line, and we're exactly in the middle of the page. So it must be about 25 lines from the top and from the bottom, my guess. Maybe 20. Maybe 20.
More like 20, yeah.
20? Okay. 20 lines from the bottom of the page. B'neherda Masnu. We're on page 17b. In Neherda, they learned as follows. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda says the name of Shmuel. Schach posel be'emtza posel bi'arba. Invalid schach in the middle invalidates it with 4 handbreadths. Menatzad posel bi'arba amos. From the side, it invalidates it with 4 amos, and the reason is because you get the rule of Dofen Akuma. We can look at the schach on the side of the sukkah as if the wall is bent. That's for Rav Amar, but Rav says bein menatzad bein be'emtza be'arba amos. Rav says whether from the side.
Rang the doorbell.
Whether from the side or whether in the middle, you have up to 4 cubits of invalid schach. And I again am going to just remind you that we're talking about a case where the sukkah is a 3-walled sukkah, and the non-kosher schach is going from the middle wall all the way to the entrance, empty wall, where there's no wall. So it's going throughout your entire sukkah, And the reason why it's going to invalidate your sukkah, either according to Shmuel with 4 handbreadths, or according to Rav, 4 cubits, either way, it's invalidating your sukkah because what it's doing is separating your sukkah in half into 2 sukkahs that each have only 2 walls. And that is going to ruin your sukkah. So that's the case that we're dealing with. It's a schach puzzle issue. It's an invalid schach problem, and it's going to invalidate your sukkah depending on the opinion. It's either 4 handbreadths or 4 cubits is the amount that will invalidate your sukkah. Less than that will not invalidate your sukkah. Tanan, we learned in a Mishnah, Nasan aleha neser. If a person put on the schach, on the sukkah, he put a neser, a board. Shehu rachav arba tefachim. Its width is 4 handbreadths. So the Mishnah says sheira. It's kosher. Now, let's understand this as if it's saying this in the middle, that in the middle of your sukkah, you have 4 handbreadths of non-kosher schach, seemingly, because it's 4 handbreadths, and it's going to be kosher. It's going to be, the Mishnah says it's kosher. Now, it's non-kosher schach. Why is it kosher? So, Bishleima, this is good, L'Rav, according to Rav, because you get up to 4 cubits. So you have non-kosher schach, it's 4 handbreadths, but it's not yet 4 cubits. So even though it's non-kosher schach, it's going to be kosher. This is good according to Rav, the Omar, that says, Bein be'emtza, bein menatzad, bi'arba amas. You have up to, whether on the side, whether in the middle, whether on the side, you get up to 4 cubits of non-kosher schach. So mishum hachi, because of this, keshera, the sukkah will be kosher. You did not invalidate the sukkah by having this board there. It doesn't reach, it's not sufficient to ruin your sukkah. So that's good according to Rav. It's kshera. Now, if it would be 4 amos, that would be another story. That would invalidate your sukkah. But it's 4 cubits, so it's in the middle of the sukkah. It's 4 handbreadths. It's kosher. It's not kosher schach, but the sukkah is kosher. Elul Shmuel, but according to Shmuel, that in the middle of the sukkah, all you have is 4 handbreadths, up to 4 handbreadths. But once it reaches 4 handbreadths, it invalidates your sukkah. According to Shmuel, Damar be'emtza bi'arba, that he says in the middle of your sukkah, if you have 4 handbreadths, it invalidates your sukkah. Amai kshera. Why is it going to be kosher over here? Why does the Mishnah say it's kosher? You've got this non-kosher schach, and it is 4 cubits. It reaches the size that invalidates your sukkah. According to Shmuel, it should invalidate your sukkah. Why is it kshera? So the Gemara answers that the meaning of the Mishnah is different. And here, what are we talking about? That it's min hatzad. That we're dealing with, you have that on the side of your sukkah, you have 4 handbreadths of non-kosher schach. No problem. Why is it no problem? Because it's daif and akuma. You got the law of daif and akuma. It would be in the middle of the sukkah. This would actually invalidate your sukkah. You don't have a law of daif and akuma in the middle of the sukkah, and your maximum size is up to 4 handbreadths, and this is 4 handbreadths. It will ruin your sukkah. So that's Shmuel, the way Shmuel. So Shmuel learns the Mishnah that's talking about on the side, and it's because of the law of daif and akuma. Okay, so that we've answered now the question on Shmuel. Toshima, come in here. Shnei sadinim. If you have 2 sheets. Now, sheets are invalid for schach because they are mekabel tumah. They are susceptible to tumah. And these sheets, mitzdarfin l'shir, mitzdarfin, what did I say? Shnei mitzdarfin. These sheets are mitzdarif. They are mitzdarif, and they join together to invalidate your sukkah. So you got two sheets. They're not kosher for schach, And not only that, but they are mitzdarfen. They will join together to the measure of non-kosher schach. Shnei nasarim, unless they have two boards, so and they're together. So ein mitzdarfen, they're not going to join together in order to invalidate your sukkah, because this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds that there's no issue of having boards for schach. Boards come from the ground. It's true that they're similar to a roof, but according to one of the understandings in the previous Mishnayos that we learned, one of the understandings of the Gemara of one of the Mishnahs, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, we're not worried about people making a mistake or the person himself making a mistake, making it similar to his roof, and therefore we're going to allow boards for schach. He has no problem, even if they're 4 handbreadths. According to Rabbi Meir, it's a problem. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's not a problem. So Rabbi Yehuda says you have 2 nasarim, they don't join together to ruin your sukkah, because he doesn't have a problem of a gzeira, doesn't make a decree against using these boards. Rabbi Meir says nasarim kisadinim, that the boards are just like the sheets, and of course they join together and ruin your sukkah. And he holds that you're not allowed to use boards for schach, and the reason is that they are similar to a roof, and it'll invalidate your sukkah. Now, bishleima lahach lishna, it's good according to this version, to Amar Rav, that Rav says bein be'emtza bein menatzad b'arba amos, that if you hold that you have up to 4 cubits, so then you could explain here what's going on. So the way it was taught in Neher Da was Rav held that whether on the side, whether in the middle of the sukkah, you get up to 4 cubits of non-kosher schach. So here it talks about mitzdarfin, joining together. So my mitzdarfin, what does it mean that the boards join together, and the nasarim are like sadinim, they join together, they're like sheets, and they will join together. Mitzdarfin liarba amos, they will join together, even though each of the boards are, let's say, 4 handbreadths, and nevertheless, they can join together in order to invalidate your sukkah, which would mean that they join together and reach the amount of 4 cubits. So each of them alone is only 4 handbreadths, and together with other boards, they'll reach the 4 cubit problem, and it'll invalidate your sukkah. So that's the understanding of it. It's really following the opinion of Rav's understanding before, that Reb Meir holds 4 handbreadth boards are problematic. Reb Yehuda argued on that, and therefore he says that Rav, that the way Rav understood it before, that's the type of measurement of a board that we're dealing with. It's 4 handbreadths. If you add enough of those boards together, you'll get 4 cubits, and this will invalidate the sukkah. They'll join together. Ela lahach lishna, but according to this version, the Amar Rav, that Rav holds biemtza be'arba, that in the middle of the sukkah you have 4 handbreadths and not 4 cubits. This means that the version of surah, this is really the version that was said and learned in surah. So according to that version, so you only have the 4 handbreadths. Heichi dami, how do we talk about in the Mishnah or the Brisa, where it talks about joining together? How do we mention this concept of joining together? Heichi dami, what is it talking about? You have boards that are going to join together. Id ispahu arba, if the board itself has 4 handbreadths. Lama lahu, it's the roof. What would you need to join? Why would you join it together with others? Id lespahu, arba. If it doesn't have four, so then it's kosher according to everyone. Kanya bialmaninu. These are regular, like reeds, and that should be kosher for schach. So why would you join it together to ruin your sukkah if they're kosher? Again, we're following Rav's understanding before, and we're continuing to say that how could Rav, the version, say that Rav holds this, and we know what Rav said earlier, and how could you join the two together? It won't work. This must be the right version. The Gemara is like trying to say this must be the right version, because the version over there, how would Rav learn it? Why? Because Rav's understanding of the previous law about these boards was that Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda argue on boards that are 4 handbreadths. That was Rav's understanding in the previous Mishnah much earlier on. Now, basically, 4 handbreadths, according to Reb Meir, will invalidate a sukkah. Now, if it's less than 4 handbreadths, it will not. It's not a problem. It's kosher schach. Now, if it's so simple like that, then why does a brisa tell us about boards joining together? How would you join boards together? They're either kosher schach or they're invalid schach. That's going to invalidate a sukkah because they're 4 handbreadths, which makes the board non-kosher for schach, and it reaches the threshold that invalidates a sukkah. 4 handbreadths also invalidates a sukkah. So it's called schach pasul, and it's called a sukkah psula. The schach is pasul, it's non-kosher schach. And if you put it on your sukkah, you ruin the sukkah. It's the same measurement, 4 handbreadths. So why would you ever join boards together? Again, if boards are smaller than that, then they are kosher schach. So of course you would not join kosher schach with kosher schach and say, oh, it's invalid. So what is he joining together boards with other boards? They're either kosher schach or they're invalid in the first place, and you don't need to join anything together. So the Gemara answers that li'olam really the isbehu arba. Each of these boards has 4 handles. Umay mitzdarfen. What does Reb Meir mean when he says that the boards will join together? He means that mitzdarfen li'arba amos min hatzad, means that they will join together to 4 cubits from on the side of your sukkah, and they will ruin your sukkah because they will be too much, and they will override the rule of Daifen Akuma. They will ruin the law. They will be too much. If you have too many of them, they will mess up your sukkah because it'll be too much for Daifen Akuma. Daifen Akuma is only up to 4 cubits, and this will go beyond that. It will invalidate your sukkah. So that's what he's talking about in the brisa, that the 2 sadinim are mitzdaref, and the nasarim are like sadinim. The Meir holds that the sheets are going to invalidate your sukkah, and they'll join together. And the nasarim, the boards, will also join together on the side of your sukkah, and they will ultimately reach the amount of 4 cubits. And if it's 4 cubits or more, it'll invalidate your sukkah, and it won't be kosher. Now, this was the second question. Now comes a third question. What's the third question? Toshima, come in here. Sikcha ben asarim shel eres. If you were mesachech your sukkah, you roofed your sukkah with boards of cedar. Sheyesh bahen, that they have in them, arba'a, 4 handbreadths. So you have these boards that are 4 handbreadths. It says whether Reb Meir or whether Reb Yehuda, these are going to be psula. They're invalid. Now, why would that be? Well, because this is the typical case of a roof. It looks exactly like a roof of a house, and therefore we're going to say that you can't use these type of boards. Now, Ein Bahen Arba, but if they don't have four hand breadths, again, if they have four hand breadths, we're basically saying that even Reb Yehuda, who was lenient, sounded in a previous Mishnah like he was lenient. It's gonna be it's invalid because you use these for your schach, and it's similar to a roof. It's invalid. Now, if it's less than four, Reb Meir Poisel, Reb Yehuda Machshir. If it's less than four, Reb Meir invalidates this for schach because between 3 and 4, according to one opinion, Shmuel's view in the previous Mishnah, one of the previous Mishnahs, he holds that Reb Meir is machmir when it's over 3 hand breaths, even if it's not 4. It's also poisel. It also invalidates the sukkah. Reb Yehuda says no. This is kosher schach. So that is the first part of the brisa. The brisa continues and says, "Umayda Reb Meir," but Reb Meir agrees that, and this is, we turn the page. We're now on 18a. Reb Meir agrees, "Shem yesh bein neser leneser, k'malei neser, shemaniach psol beinayim sheva." That Reb Meir agrees that even the boards that are 4 hand breadths, if you have empty space in between each of these boards, the same size as the boards, that means it's, let's say, 4 hand breadths. Yeah, 4 hand breadths empty, 4 hand breadths a board, 4 hand breadths empty. So you can put psal beinayim, you can put kosher schach, psal, interesting, very confusing word, psal. Psal sounds like puzzle, which means invalid, but it also is psilas, of the geirin, the refuse of the field, that which is what you're supposed to use for schach. So you can place the psal, which is kosher schach. Remember, psal means kosher schach. You can place kosher schach in between these boards, beinayim, uksheira, and it'll be kosher. So now comes the Gemara. The Gemara is going to try to elaborate on what. So what is the question? So the Gemara says, Bishloima, this is good. Leman di Amar, according to the opinion that says, Bein be'emtza bein menatzad bi'arba amos, that whether you have non-kosher schach on the side, whether you have non-kosher schach in the middle, the measurement is 4 cubits. That'll be good. Why? Mishum hachi, because of that, it says, Sheira, the sukkah will be kosher. Because why? Because you don't have a measurement of 4 cubits that's going to invalidate the sukkah. Ela laman de Amar, but according to the opinion that be'emtza is bi'arba, that you only have 4, the measurement to invalidate your sukkah is 4 hand breaths. I'm like, Sheira, how could the sukkah be kosher? You have empty space of 4 hand breaths. Okay, that's nice. But you also have boards that are 4 hand breaths, and they should invalidate your sukkah. So what comes out from here is that how could anyone hold that 4 hand breaths is going to be invalidating a sukkah if we have here clearly that it's going to be a way, even Reb Meir would agree to have a kosher sukkah if you have these, even though you have these boards there, you have these boards that are non-kosher schach, and you can as long as there's empty space, it's kosher. What do you mean? You have the board, it's non-kosher. It's 4 hand breaths. So the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yeshua, hacha b'sukkah d'leihavya el shmeina mitzumtzames askima. We're dealing with a sukkah, and this we did learn this really before, that we're dealing with a sukkah that has exactly 8 cubits, and how many hand breadths are in 8 cubits? So a hand breadth, there are 6 hand breadths in a cubit. So if you have 8 cubits, that means there's 48 hand breadths. The Yohiv Neser Upsal V'neser upsol mehagisa. So you put a board, the empty space with kosher schach, psal is kosher schach, next to each other. Then you have a board and psal kosher schach next to it, and then a board and kosher schach next to it. So altogether, you got 3 boards and 3 kosher schachs. Each of them are 4 handbreadths. That's 6 times 4 is 24. Now we're halfway there. We've got 48. So you got neser psal, neser psal, neser psal. So the middle of your sukkah now at this point is psal. It's kosher schach. And now, and you did it from one side, now you start at the other side. V'neser upsol, v'neser upsol, v'neser upsol mehagisa. You start from the other side. So you got the 2 sides. You got non-kosher schach, kosher schach, non-kosher schach, kosher schach, non-kosher schach. And now the middle is 2 kosher schachs next to each other. So from the other side, you got neser upsol and neser upsol mehagisa from the other side. In the law is the havu lahu shnei psalin. Now you have altogether 2 kosher schachs of each 4 handbreadths together each. So that means altogether 8 handbreadths. And the ika hechsher sukkah be'emtza, and you have the kosher, the minimum amount of a kosher sukkah is 7 handbreadths. You actually have 8 handbreadths. So your sukkah is kosher based on the way the sukkah is made, the roof of this sukkah is made, that even though 4 handbreadths is, according to one opinion, invalidates the sukkah, this sukkah actually will not be invalidated. And basically it boils down to the law of Daifan Akuma. You got the on the side of the sukkah, you have Daifan Akuma. In the middle, you got kosher schach. And it ends up being a kosher sukkah. So even if you hold that 4 handbreadths invalidates a sukkah, but this sukkah won't be invalidated because basically the 4 handbreadths are on the side, basically Daifan Akuma. So if it would be in the middle, it would be a problem. But here you got them on the side, it's not a problem. So that's basically the end of this discussion of the 2 opinions of how much invalid schach will invalidate your sukkah in the middle. Yes, Jeffrey.
So aren't they also saying that your arrangement is very important? That because even in the opinion that says if you put them together next to one another, they would invalidate, even though there's a side that says, but those boards are okay because they're exactly 4 handbreadths. So by arranging it, you don't make it look like a roof.
So the thing is, what would happen if you did put boards instead of all of the schach instead of all of those schachs on the side? Only the middle you have the kosher schach, the 8 handbreadths of kosher schach. And let's say everything else was just boards. What would be the law then?
It's too big for Daifan Akuma then, right?
No, it's not.
No, okay, so then that'll be okay.
It'll still be good. So does it really have to be this way? In other words, the way you were starting out was you were trying to explain why does it have to be this way? A neser psal, neser psal, neser psal. And what you're seeing is actually maybe it doesn't have to be this way. It's only for the middle. The middle has to be this way. So why does it pick such a case? That is a question that's asked in the commentaries. Why is that? It's very surprising that it tells us this whole thing, because you really don't need it. It's called Daifan Akuma. It could be all non-kosher schach or, a little kosher schach, non-kosher. It doesn't matter. It's all non-kosher is fine. So why do you need to do 1 yes, 1 not, 1 yes, 1 not? Why would we need it to be this way? That is a question. One of the opinions which is not accepted, the Meiri brings an opinion that says that, why it says it this way? Because really, you would be allowed to sit under the kosher schach on the side. But I mean, how could that be? The Meiri argues on it. How could that be? It's called a daifin, it's called a wall, But there is that is one of the basically an answer to why you would do it that way. You would end up being allowed to stand, I guess, I don't know how you could sit in that small 4 handbreadths, but you could maybe stand, maybe sideways or something in that area. But in any event, that's not the accepted view.
And they're not saying that even the ones who say that 4 handbreadth boards are invalid. They're not saying that when you put it together with regular kosher schach, that you combine those in such a way that it's the opposite of combining 2 boards.
Yeah, it doesn't work. You can't. Somehow, it's not. It's
Okay,
not going to be combined. Maybe there's a way to do it, but this is not working that way. It wasn't what you would call chavtan. It didn't work that way, right?
If somebody is very practical, though, in other words, they could all make sure that they just chip a little bit off on each board, and then everybody would say it's okay, and you can sit anywhere.
Well, if the boards are 3 handbreadths, and you chip off from the boards maybe before you put them on, because we saw that if you turn them to the side, it's even a problem.
Correct.
So,
but that was because there were 4. Those were the 4 handbreadths.
So,
but if it's pachos,
or no, well, maybe or 3 according to Reb Meir, right? There was Reb Meir's view that anything between 3 and, according to the way Shmuel learned that argument, that Reb Meir would hold even 3 between 3 and 4. So even then would be a problem. So the thought would be if you would buy something small, buy smaller ones. Now nowadays, the roofs we use smaller boards for roofs. The way they roof the sukkah, the way they roof a house seems much smaller than these thick boards.
Well, I've seen, like, if they use 4x8s, like these big pieces of
4 inches, 4 inches by 8 inches, 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet,
4 feet by 8 feet, and they put these big planks on the roof here. In New England, I don't know about Florida, but
no, here,
and then they
I've
put
seen them.
they put this black cover, and then they put the asphalt shingles here.
Right. So under that, here in Florida, they don't just put a piece of plywood. Well, at least some houses, they have boards going across like 2x4s. I don't know. Maybe that's strange, but that's if I'm not mistaken. And so it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch and the Paiskim that say nowadays you shouldn't use the boards because we use even smaller boards. So like it seems like this is an interesting area of halacha where even though the Chachamim made a decree about a certain measurement, but we seem to take it even stricter because nowadays this is the way it's done, and so it should apply. It's an interesting thing because normally we would say if the rabbis made the decree, we don't, we're not adding, we're not subtracting. Whatever they made the decree, that's what they made the decree, and goodbye. But here it seems like the Paiskim seem to want to say that it should be a problem. Now maybe if you used 1x1s or something, or 2x1s, that you don't use for schach. Maybe I know a Rav here that uses boards, like small ones for his sukkah. So I guess he's relying on other places.
They make 1x3s at Home Depot.
Right.
You can buy 1x3.
Right. Yeah. So maybe that would be yes, Jeffrey.
So I know I used to have a problem when we expanded our sukkah. I have bamboo, but it couldn't go across an expanded sukkah. By 8x8, I was fine. So I had to have that was the only time that I ever used a very thin board, all the way across the middle.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's not an issue.
Two sukkahs or not, I'm not sure.
No, that's not an issue. Yeah.
Because you really have to. I even interwove the thin ends of the bamboo to try to hold up, but it would sink a little bit.
Yeah, no.
Middle. So you really needed something stronger.
No, you could put boards for that. That's not a problem. You could put boards to hold up the sukkah. Okay. Zai gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Thank you.